Now, we're going to talk about the different needs to have an actual business continuity plan in place, and a lot of it seems intuitive. Of course, we need to have something in place in case a disaster happens and that we can keep the company running. But there's a lot of much more detail-oriented information that you need to understand if you are responsible for developing the plan. If you are a CSO or a CISO who's overseeing a team that is developing this type of a plan, and all that encompasses it, because this is a really large project that can actually take up to 3 years to complete. So think about your actual company, your organization. Most organizations actually aren't prepared. If you look at a lot of the statistics that have been created, most organizations are not properly prepared to deal with a large disaster, maybe a small issue that can be dealt with. But if the facility is destroyed or even half of it's wiped out, most companies are not ready for that. So some of the questions that you can ask to understand if your company is properly prepared is your organization impact tolerant? Meaning that do you actually understand the impacts that your company may go through, and can you recover from that? That's what impact tolerant means. Have you mitigated points of failure? And that means you have to actually identify the points of failure that would negatively affect your company overall, which we're going to go through. That means to identify the critical functions, the critical resources, the backup solutions. Are the personnel prepared on and properly trained on what they need to do? Now, this is something that most companies don't do well, is that they may actually develop the policy and the plan, but they don't get the necessary people involved who actually has to carry this out if a disaster takes place. A lot of times it's just a team that creates documentation, it's approved, and then it's put away. And if the people don't know what to do when something happens, it's kind of a waste of time. So is everything documented properly? We're going to walk through the different things that actually need to be documented. It's not just the development of a BCP. There's procedures, there's teams, there's a lot of things that need to be written down so that in the time of chaos that people can actually follow them. And is your BCP current? We'll talk about this at the end of the domain. A lot of these plans go out of date right away because our environments are so dynamic. Our technology changes, maybe our business model changes, maybe we merge with another company. And a BCP is such a large project that a lot of people think of it as a project, meaning there's a stop and there's a start. We're done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. But it has to be continually updated. So reviewing it, and if you see it's outdated, then you're not ready. Your company's not properly ready. So over time, I've known people who are in this industry of developing these types of plans, and they didn't have a lot of work because for years it's been hard to actually do the sell to management, because management has to pay for something that they don't see a direct effect on their bottom line. They see a negative effect in that they have to pay for the resources to carry it out, but it doesn't help their profit. So a lot of times it was a hard sell to management that this actually had to be paid for and carried out. Now, after 9/11, in America, the mentality of the need for BCP has definitely changed. And this is why this is one domain that actually years ago in the CISSP exam did not get hit as much. It wasn't as emphasized as it is now. BCP is very important for the exam, and you get many more questions on it than you did in the past, because after 9/11 happened and after different types of disasters that have taken place, companies have gone out of business. So the mentalities have changed within the organization, so it's an easier sell to management, but we have to make sure that people know what BCP is, how to develop these things, and that's kind of a skill set that is rare. So in 9/11, that's one of the largest disasters that most people are aware of, and a lot of people focus on the actual towers that came down. but there are thousands of businesses around this environment, around these towers that were negatively affected that can never come back online, never come back to business. Now, some of the companies who already had plans in place and could move their processing to another location right away, they survived. But a lot of companies that most people don't think of were negatively affected and shut down. So as we are rebuilding our towers after 9/11, a lot of companies, this is a wake-up call, saying that, yes, we need to plan for bad things because bad things can happen. Now, it doesn't mean that, like I said, most organizations aren't 100% ready, which means that they can't really recover. But at least companies have started to develop these plans. There's more awareness with the board members, with senior management, and this is being integrated into security programs overall. Now, this is an older list of FEMA disaster list, and you can go on the FEMA site and actually see the disasters that have taken place. But what I find most interesting about this list is the amount of disasters that happen every other day that we're not aware of, because there's so many disasters that take place. We only hear about the big ones. So, you know, some companies can think, well, we're not in New York, we're not in Washington, D.C., we're not in Florida for all the hurricanes, but there's tornadoes and there's a lot of other flooding and a lot of other things that take place all the time. And if people really understood the amount of disasters that took place, maybe that would help with really putting the amount of money and effort into the business continuity that's needed. So the first question would be, do we even have a plan? And that may seem ridiculous, but a lot of companies don't. So the first thing is see what we actually have to work from. Now, there's actually a difference between disaster recovery and business continuity. Disaster recovery deals with more of the IT of the company, getting the network up and running, getting the communication lines up and running, the systems up and running. And disaster recovery has to do with how do we survive a disaster and how do we get back up running right away. So it's kind of the smaller timeline of a disaster just happened, how do we get our technology up and running. Now, business continuity has a different focus. It's not just about how do we get up and running right away, it's how do we stay in business as we are working in a crippled state. Because after disaster takes place, basically you carry out your disaster recovery plan. You get the technology and things actually running, but how do you know you can actually stay in business? And this has to do with understanding the critical functions that, like bring in the necessary revenue to keep the company going, that you have the necessary skill set, that you understand which functions have to come up first. So they actually have two different focuses, but they work together. Now, some companies will have a specific disaster recovery plan, while other companies will combine them. So you can have a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity plan, but a lot today they're actually combining them. It depends on how your company deals with it. But for the exam, you definitely need to know the difference between the two and that they have different focuses. And there's sometimes that you just need your disaster recovery plan to get back up because it's a smaller thing that took place. And you don't have to, you're not going to go into a crippled state. You can get your technology or whatever went down back up and running, and you don't actually have to activate your business continuity plan. So, you know, why do we need to have the business continuity plan? Although a lot of this seems intuitive, some of it isn't. Some of it we just think, well, we have to be able to run the company and make sure it keeps running. Well, that's true, but there's specific parts of the plan itself that you have to lay out the right procedures, the right personnel, the right steps. So one of the first things is what are we going to do in emergency situations? That's when people are hurt, you know, how do we get a hold of police, the ambulances, who does first aid, those types of things. We have to make sure that the number one issue is protecting lives. It's not about protecting computers first, it's protecting lives. Then we need to, the overall reason that we have the BCP is to reduce the risk, reduce the impact. So every company could potentially go through some type of disaster, but the goal is to be resilient enough to have enough recovery solutions or preventive solutions in place that you could deal with that impact and still go on. So we need to be able to work with outside vendors during the recovery. We need to reduce the confusion, and that's why we have like these written procedures that we're going to talk about, is because when a disaster takes place, it's a very chaotic and emotional time, and the people need, not only do they need written procedures to follow, they need to have practiced them. They need to have gone through drills so that they know how to fall into and carry out the responsibilities. And this is why, like in the military drills and drills and drills and drills. And the reason that they do that is because these people will go into war or situations that are emotional, that are scary, that are chaotic, and if the procedures are drilled into them, then they don't have to, they could just go in and do their job. It doesn't matter. Basically, it's part of them. They know what to do. So, and again, we have to make sure that the business can survive. That's the whole thing. We need to make sure that the business does not go down the tubes just because we had some type of disaster. Now, today there's actually more reasons to have a BCP in place, and it's not just about the items I just talked about, even though those are important, but BCP is now part of business decisions. If I'm a supplier, I'm going to provide your company with some type of services or parts or something. Before we set up a partnership, it's very common for your company to require my company to lay out our BCP. Because basically, why would you depend on my company if we don't have anything in place to protect our services if we go through a disaster? So a lot of business decisions on partnerships and relying on suppliers, now there's a component to say, we need to make sure you're going to be up and running even if you go through some type of trouble, because our revenue directly affects how you react. And another issue, it has to do with regulatory requirements. More and more regulations are requiring different companies to have BCPs in place. And then insurance. Insurance is looking more and more at what type of recovery plan you have in place, because if it's just like health insurance, if you're smoking and eating donuts every day and not running and you've got all these problems, you're probably not going to get insurance, or it's going to be a higher rate. And so the same with the company. If you have a healthy company, you take preventive measures, then you can get insurance, and it could be a reduced rate. So this is not just about surviving a disaster. Even prior to any disaster taking place, it is a component of business decisions that happen between companies. So this needs to be set up as a framework. We need to have strategic and operational framework that basically is going to build the resilience into the business processes. And that sounds great, and it sounds easy when you either read it in a book or you see it on a slide, but it's actually much more complex, and we're going to walk through why. But if you have to understand how the company works, you have to understand how the business processes take place, you have to understand all the vulnerabilities and threats, what the necessary solutions are. So this is not an easy task. So BCP needs to be a component of every security program in every organization. And really, when you look at developing a security program that we discussed in Domain 1, and you need to build a secure enterprise that we'll look at, BCP always has to be a component. And I think it's a good thing about the CISSP exam is that it covers so many different components that need to be part of the security program. A lot of people who are in security have a very focused view of what security is. It's technology, it's firewalls, it's IDS, and they don't think about physical security or cryptography or business continuity. But if you don't have those things in place properly, it may not matter if you have a secure network. So business continuity has to be a component in your whole structure for your business program. So we're going to go through the actual steps of how to put together a business continuity plan. And this is not only good for the exam, but this is a very good resource if you have to go through this process within your organization. Because a lot of people, a lot of organizations that have to set up this type of disaster recovery plan and business continuity plan have a real hard time knowing where to start, where to get the data, the steps of 1, 2, 3, 4, how to actually do this. And so what we'll be doing is going through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the necessary process. So we'll start with the policy, which what you have to understand about your organization is what are the business drivers, which would mean like who would require a BCP, other partners, if you're a supplier, what are your legal obligations, because there's laws that dictate that you have to protect certain types of information, or you have to provide certain types of services no matter what regulatory requirements do you have. We'll look at the scope issue. Then we'll go through the steps of a business impact analysis. We'll look at preventative controls that should be put in place. We'll look at different recovery strategies, because it's not just one recovery strategy. You have to break it up into all the steps or all the levels within the organization that needs to be recovered. Then we'll go into actually constructing a business continuity plan itself, and we'll talk about the different drills, and then go into how a plan is maintained. Now, we're going to go through the steps that I just laid out, and there's different models of developing a BCP. There's different approaches to it, but they all have the exact same information because they have to. So you could see different models or different approaches that maybe have 2 steps smushed into one, or maybe they spread them out a little bit, but they all have the same thing, because you have to do the exact same steps. You have to collect the same type of information, because it all has the same goal of protecting the critical functions. So in the CISSP exam, the specific steps that's laid out for them is project initiation, business impact analysis, recovery strategy, plan design and development, implementation, testing, and continual maintenance. So you may get a question on which step comes first, and the actual sequence of these. So you'll need to know those steps for the exam. So do you think we need to writing this stuff down? Absolutely. Unfortunately, some companies will just develop the plan itself or just a policy and not have substantial documentation that supports it. And that's why I'm going to show you some actual examples of documentation that needs to be in place. Otherwise, once the sky falls and there's some type of disaster, without documentation, it'll be real hard to actually follow through what has already been agreed upon for the recovery strategies. So we have an example of the different stages that ISC² lays out for developing the business continuity plan. And you see that there's a start and a required completion date and actual approval, because it shouldn't just be one group or one person developing this stuff and they think it's good enough. It has to go through an approval process, which means senior management will be involved. So I said that there's a difference between the business continuity policy and the plan. So the policy, just like any other policy, it's a higher level, and it gives direction for how this process is supposed to be carried out. So the policy should state the actual scope of the project, the roles and responsibilities, who's doing what type of risk analysis method will be used, whether it be qualitative, quantitative, functional analysis, which we'll talk about what that means, methods for how we're going to go about gathering the data, managing the process, testing the requirements, employee awareness, and how to keep this plan up to date. So just like any other policy, it's a high-level document that has management's directives of how something is supposed to be carried out. And this is kind of, this is what we follow when we're actually developing the plan, so we know to stay in check, we know what level of protection that's required, etc. So as an example for a policy, and you can get policy samples off of like businesscontinuity.com. You'll have an introduction that will talk about what this policy is supposed to accomplish. You'll have like an executive overview. Then you'll have the leadership, which is who's responsible. And so you can actually get these samples that'll step you through what your policy needs to be made up of. So we need a leader. We need somebody who's going to lead this whole thing. And that person is called the coordinator, the BCP coordinator. And it needs to be a certain type of person. It needs to be somebody who understands the company, has the ability to work with people, because really several people are going to have to come together to make this work. And they really have to have kind of a personality of getting a team together, charging them up. It also has to be the right level within the organization, because the coordinator is going to be between the team who's going to develop the plan and carry out the plan and senior management. So this coordinator has to have access to senior management to ask questions, to keep them updated. And that's important, because sometimes organizations will have somebody who oversees the development of this, but they don't have direct access to senior management. Senior management just figures it's being taken care of, and they're not being constantly updated. So it needs to be the right level within the organization so they have direct access to senior management. And they need to have the authority to be able to basically tell people that they have to get to work. Because this shouldn't be like a voluntary thing of come and work on the BC plan if you want to. This is something usually people who already have other positions within the company, they see it as extra work. They already have jobs that are 60-hour-a-week jobs, and now they're given this. And so sometimes there's pushback into working on this, and that's why the coordinator needs to have enough authority to make sure people are carrying out the responsibilities. So it's not just the coordinator. We need to develop a team, and we're going to talk about what makes up this team. But unless somebody who's running this team, like the coordinator, actually understands this process that we're going through, you get into paralysis analysis. They keep getting together, they keep having meetings, and there's nothing that moves forward. So some organizations will bring in a consultant who specializes in developing these plans, so that because they understand the process, the team members understand the company. But if you don't have somebody who actually understands how this is supposed to work, all the steps that we're talking about, you'll just constantly have meetings and not get anywhere. So who should make up the BCP team? Should it just be IT? Should it just be HR? Should it just be management? It actually should be made up of a representative of different groups, different organizations, or different departments within the company. And that's because if you think about it, if only IT made up the BCP plan, then they would only think about the risks that would happen to the technology and the network. If it was only HR, then they would only think about what would happen to HR processes, etc. So everybody sees their own little piece of the world, And so you need to bring all of these people together for a team, different perspectives of the types of threats that can happen to the company, the type of recovery things that can be put in place. And whoever you expect to carry out this plan should be participating in the development of the plan. Because, think about it. If you weren't involved with developing this plan and all of a sudden disaster came around and you're responsible for now carrying out some activities, this is all maybe new to you. But if you were part of this team, getting together every month or every other month or however, and were part of the team to actually build it, you would have a much more intimate understanding of what needs to take place. So once the team is developed, once the coordinator is identified, you need to think about the project sizing, which means what types of threats are we going to look at? Because there's an amazing amount of threats that can affect a company. We're going to look at natural disasters. That's most common, any type of floods, tornadoes, hurricanes. But are we also going to look at technical issues, meaning that if our communication line goes down, if our network goes down, what about our supply systems like electrical power, HVAC system, and then there's also human-made issues where there could be riots, or there could be terrorism, or there could be vandalism. So why it's important to understand what you're going to look at, your scope, is because you can't really prepare for everything. A lot of companies will develop a BCP plan to deal with the larger issues, the actual catastrophes that can happen or the disasters. And the smaller issues like a server going down or a communication link going down, that would be dealt with continuity plans for that specific department. So a lot of times a organization like the IT group will have continuity plans to deal with the smaller issues, and then the business continuity and disaster recovery deals with the much larger issues. But the team has to decide what's going in there, and management should be, of course, they have to approve that. So along with the project sizing is the actual scope. What all are we supposed to protect? Is it just this building? Is it the two, maybe we have a building, we have a campus, we have a whole campus. How large, how many facilities are we supposed to protect? Do we have to sync this up with our other facilities? Meaning that if we go down and they go down, are we supposed to cover all of that, or do we just look at our facility and they have to look at their facility? So understanding the scope is quite important because you'll never know when you're done. And you don't have an infinite amount of money and an infinite amount of time to do this. So properly developing the scope is critical on what you're supposed to protect. Okay, one of the most critical parts of developing this plan, and one of the things that get hit the most on the exam, is the risk analysis steps. And this is called a business impact analysis. And basically a business impact analysis is a risk analysis. And in Domain 1 we went through risk analysis, coming up with how to quantify or qualify risk. We went through that pretty deep. So I'm not going to repeat how to do a full risk analysis. I'm assuming that you've gone through that domain. So this is basically a risk analysis, but it's got a different focus of if there's a disaster happen, how can our company still survive? So we're going to step through each one of the components that needs to be carried out in the analysis, which would be identifying the critical business functions, identifying how we're going to gather data, whether it's going to be through surveys or workshops, how we're going to carry out the analysis, if it's going to be quantitative or qualitative. Once we identify the critical business function, what do they need? What do these functions actually require? Software, hardware, people. Then we need to figure out how long these critical functions can last without these resources. So we need to calculate what's called MTD, and we'll go through that. We need to identify the vulnerabilities and threats to these critical functions. We need to develop the necessary backup solutions and resources that are required for those resources, but then we have to come up with a solution for the whole company, because there's one thing of coming up with a backup for a server or a backup for one function within an organization, but that's different than a recovery solution for the whole company, which is required. So the first step of the business impact analysis is to identify the critical business functions. And that seems as though that would be a simple thing, because if your company prints checks, well, it needs to keep printing checks. If your company is a telecommunication company, then it needs to keep those telecommunications up and running. But it gets more complex than that. And we need to figure out how you're going to actually gather the data to figure out what are the most critical functions in your company. Because it's not that there's just going to be one critical function. There's actually going to be like a hierarchy of critical functions. Maybe two things absolutely have to be up and running within minutes. And then another function has to be running within an hour. Another function has to be running up within 24 hours. But you as a team don't necessarily know exactly what has to come up when. So you have to gather this data. You gather it from the different departments. You do interviews, you do workshops, you do surveys. And that's why actually developing a business continuity plan takes so long, is because of all the information you have to gather. And usually people are in meetings or they're on vacation. So gathering the data is usually one of the longest pieces of developing this plan. So the different parts of the company will supply you with the information so that the team can start putting things together to figure out which is most critical. Now, what's important is whoever's supplying the information, whoever's doing the survey or you're doing an interview with, they need to be the right level within the department. So for example, some managers, like business unit managers, they don't want to be bothered. They're busy, they don't want to be bothered with this interview. So they'll put a junior person there, and the junior person doesn't have a whole overview or understanding of the department. It needs to be the right level within the different departments so you get all the necessary information. And one other thing is, this isn't really test-oriented, but once you start talking to the different functions and you explain, look, we're trying to figure out which department is most critical, every one of them will say that they're most critical. And so that makes it a little bit more difficult. Everybody thinks they're center of the universe. So you can't take their word for it. You're going to have to gather the data, understand how the company works, and look at all the business processes. So what the team is going to carry out is called a functional analysis. And a functional analysis just means you're doing exactly what I talked about. You gather data through interviews, from surveys, you review documentation, like policies and the current BCP plan that's there. You document the business functions, the transaction. You create a hierarchy of business functions. And you apply a classification scheme to the individual business units. Now, when you say classification scheme, this could be based on the security level, the confidentiality level of what needs to be protected, but usually it has to do with how critical that function is, how critical the function is to the overall company. So a functional analysis is collecting all this information, putting all the pieces together, and then saying this is more critical than this is more critical than this. So actually identifying the critical functions and how they affect the organization can be a lot more complex than one would first think. And anybody who's actually carried out or had to develop business continuity plan, they know that it's complex because a company itself is so complex. So when the team has to figure out which is the most critical function, there's several questions that have to be answered. In most profit-oriented companies, it's which one directly affects our revenue stream, because profit-oriented companies have to have continuous revenue stream to keep afloat. Now, if it's a nonprofit or some type of a government agency, they have to understand what services they absolutely have to provide. So it's not based on a revenue stream, but what services they're liable or they have to supply. So if it's a profit-oriented, it's which critical functions would directly affect our revenue stream, because if we're not making money, we're not going to be able to stay in business. What about our production environment? If one function is not up and running, how are we going to continually to work? What are the operational expenses? If a certain part of the network went down or a certain part of the facility was taken out, what are the operational expenses that are involved? Now, it's not just a monetary thing. This team also has to look at, if we can't get up and running or if we can't continue our services, how is that going to affect our reputation, which is the confidence that our customer base has, our shareholders, how much of the market we're going to lose. So that's more of an intangible versus the tangible monetary values. So you need to look at the competitive advantages. If your company was down for a week or two, don't you think another company would say, hey, come over here, we've got just what you need, and then you can lose those customers forever. You also need to look at what your contract agreements are. Like I said, that BCP is part of business decisions now. So if you are not up and running in a certain time, which negatively affects another company, the company can be sued. If you're not up and running or protecting the data as you're supposed to, then you could be breaking laws or regulatory requirements. So then you would be facing penalties. So these are just some of the things that have to be asked and answered. But you see how it's not just a direct thing of how much is it going to cost us. There's a lot of components into being able to determine really what is the most critical critical function. Now, another reason that this is complex is because of interdependencies. The functions do not work as islands within themselves. Within a company, all these functions work together. So a lot of times teams will come up with, yeah, this is the most critical function. It has to be up and running within 3 minutes. But they find out that this function can't be running unless this function and this function is up and running. So to actually understand all the interdependencies between the company departments and the business units and the business processes, you can end up with a big bowl of spaghetti. And it can seem very complex, but this is what the team's responsibility is. So to be able to understand the interdependencies and to be able to understand the actual business processes, this means that the team needs to know how the organization works. And you would think, well, of course, organization is how it works, but most don't. There's usually not one individual that can tell you A to Z all the processes that have to take place, how the processes are interlinked. And this is why you have people from different departments, because they have different views and perceptions of what happens within the company. So the team actually can't start developing or coming up with recovery solutions or developing their actual plan until they understand how this company, which is like an organism, actually works. So as I said, most people understand their own department, their own jobs, their own resources, their own functionality, but the global understanding of the company takes the team, and it takes working with senior management, because they have even a higher understanding, and they have an understanding more that deals with, like the market shares and the shareholders and such. There's a model, the Zachman model, that actually we cover in enterprise architecture. But this model's been around for a long time, and it cuts up an organization into kind of understandable or digestible components. And because it's really kind of difficult to say, okay, what takes place in this company? What makes it run? What has to be in place? You really need to kind of lay it out of what needs to be protected. You know, what type of data do we have? What type of network, where the network is, what type of personnel that we need. And you break it down into different levels. You can, like an easy way to think about it is like strategic, tactical, and operational. Strategic would be senior management, overarching understanding of how the company works. Tactical would be the middle, overseeing really operations, and would be mid-management, and then operationals would be the people actually working like an IT or carrying out the steps within the business processes. Now, this Zachman model even goes deeper than just those three levels. And it's a good model to actually review. And again, we will see it in another domain. But this is an approach of how to understand a company. Otherwise, everybody just kind of sitting around and they'll come up with this and they'll come with that, and you'll keep documenting, but it won't actually make a lot of sense until you basically have to connect all the dots to see what has to be up and running for this company. So we've gone through how to identify the critical functions, and we've done it pretty fast because at this point it usually takes groups like 7 months, maybe even a year to get to this point. So the next step is to figure out what are the resources that these functions actually need. And there's a lot of different resources. It's not just technical. I mean, you do need to know what type of networking services, what type of hardware and equipment that's necessary. You need to know what software is required. It does not just operating system, but the actual applications that's used to run the whole business, the hardware that's being used. Now, this is an interesting point, is that a lot of times when teams go through this exercise of figuring out what resources are critical to the company, they'll find out that they're using maybe in-house developed software that they couldn't replace if the whole place got blown away, or they have legacy hardware that they can no longer replace. So this is an exercise to go through and figure out we're really at risk because we can't actually replace the stuff that we depend upon. So that's when some companies will actually make the move to go to off-the-shelf software, or move to hardware that they know that vendors can replace for them. So the other resources, what type, power, we need to have some type of backup power. We need to be able to communicate to outside entities like our customers, our partners, our shareholders. How are we going to talk to them? Supplies that individuals would need, and interdepartment communication, because that's going to be very chaotic, and there still needs to be communication between the critical functions. So it's basically like you come up with these hierarchies of critical functions, and then you've got to figure out what resources each one of them needs, because you need to figure out how to make sure that there's backups, proper backups for all those resources. Another thing is point of contact. Who depends on your organization? Who has to communicate with your organization? What's coming in and what's going out that's absolutely necessary for the survival of your company. So it's not just, you can't just look within the network, within your own company, because today, our world gets smaller and smaller because we're so interconnected with everybody else. So you need to expand it out to see who do we actually contact, who would be affected, and how would we be affected if we can't communicate to them. So we need to figure out how long these critical functions can last without the resources. because up to this point we've identified the critical functions, we've identified the resources that they need, but how fast do they have to come online? That's what we need to calculate. And that the common term that's used is the MTD, the maximum tolerable downtime. And what this means is the team will have to actually calculate what if a resource goes down, how bad is that? And a lot of times, because it's revenue oriented, like a company can figure out that through their web server, their e-commerce site, they make $3.2 million every hour, something like that. Well, if that goes down for 1 hour, they could potentially lose that much revenue. And some resources may only cost them $1,000. But the goal is to figure out how long can these specific resources be down, how bad will that hurt us, because that has a direct relationship with the type of recovery solution we're going to put in place. If it has to be up and running within a minute, then we're going to have some type of redundancy that's always on. Maybe it's hot swappable hard drives, co-processing, multi-processing, which we'll talk about. If it doesn't have to come up for like 24 hours, then we could do something not as critical. Maybe it's we'll have our tape backups. Maybe we could wait on the vendor to do replacements. So that's the correlation between the MTD value. We have to basically categorize what's most critical, and that helps us determine what type of recovery solutions and backup solutions we'll put in place. So MTD value, this is a terminology used by NIST and on the CISSP exam. And the company itself, your organization, can actually come up with its own categories, you know, critical, vital, non-essential, those types of things. But this terminology is very common in the industry and specifically on the exam. So here's some interesting examples of what type of failures that could be identified, and these would be threats. Now, one thing to understand is that we're going to look at the type of threats that need to be identified, but the team actually doesn't look at what do we do if a flood comes, and they have a whole plan for that, and what do we do if a hurricane comes, and they have a whole plan for that. What do we do if a terrorist attack happens, and they have a whole different set. That's not how you develop a business continuity plan. It doesn't matter what the outside impact or what actually causes the damage. It's the damage itself. If our network goes down, what do we need to do? If our e-commerce sites go down, what do we need to do? If our facility is blown away, what do we need to do? It doesn't matter what causes it. So we have different failure types here and recovery actions. And so failure of UPS, what are we going to do? We have a redundant UPS that will take over. Failure of disk drive, we can have RAID in place, which we talk about in operations, but that's just a redundant array of inexpensive disks to ensure that if one disk goes down, we still have our data. So here's different examples. Database failure. Well, we can have disk shadowing, or we can have backups of our database to ensure that we can recover from that. So, and the team is going to indicate how many minutes or how many hours or how many days that the specific resource has to be up and running. Now, I said that MTD is, NIST uses it, and that's why it's on the CISSP exam. Most of the things on CISSP exam you can find in NIST documents, which are the best practices for the industry. Even though a corporation, an organization can come up with their own categories, like I said, you can define what critical is. Maybe critical is 2 minutes. Maybe normal is 3 days. Even though the company can come up with this, for the exam it would be a good idea if you knew what NIST lays out. Because NIST is basically, best practices. That is a framework that organizations can follow. It's not a standard, but it's best practices. So it would be a good idea for the exam that you have the correlation of non-essential would mean that it needs to be up in 30 days. The resource needs to be up in 30 days. If it falls in the category of important, then it means it needs to be up in 72 hours. If it's urgent, it needs to be up within 24 hours. So it'd be a good idea to know those categories and the time that's equated to them. So we'll quickly look at some threats, but there's a lot of threats that the team will need to look at because a company could be affected by many different things. So we talked about this a little bit, but there's natural threats, and of course if you're going to be in Kansas, you're probably going to have a higher probability of tornadoes. If you're going to be in Florida, higher probability of hurricanes. And so it'll depend upon your geographical area of what those vulnerabilities would be. Looking at technical issues, and what I had said before is the team needs to decide if it's going to look at even the smaller issues of maybe even a T1 going down. That's usually not part of your BCP because then you're going to be using it all the time. The smaller things are usually carried out by continuity plans. If your supply systems, your electrical power, your HVAC, your fire suppression, those things go out, that can have huge effects. I mean, if you think about you lose all electrical power, it doesn't matter if everything's working, you've lost all power. So what some companies will do is have redundant power lines coming in to their enterprise, and now the redundant power the feeders need to come from different transformers because that's why you have it. If in case a transformer blows up or somebody runs a car into it or there's some type of lightning or whatever, and that can negatively affect your power. Some companies have actually paid for redundant electrical feeders, power feeders, that they think is running to two different transformers or substations, but they're going to the same one. So when it goes down, both lines are down. So you actually have to investigate. Same for your, maybe you have redundant T1s or T3s. Make sure that they're not both vulnerable to the same type of disaster. Now we talked about human-made disasters. Disgruntled employees can cause big problems of all the way from deleting data, corrupting databases, to coming in with a gun. And there's been several instances where companies have not properly prepared for a disgruntled employee and they come back and they shoot a lot of people or they take people hostages. So there's a lot of things that this team needs to consider. And sometimes it requires thinking outside of the box of the threats that can take place. And some things we would think, well, that's ridiculous, it'll never happen. But when there was an outbreak of SARS, that was a big deal because we're afraid of as people traveling back and forth, that can negatively affect your company if that many people get sick or you can't do the traveling. We had the whole bird flu issue that we're kind of still dealing with, that it could blow up and it could actually be a large issue that has to be dealt with. So even if some of the things that may seem goofy or impossible, the team may need to think about, because most people didn't even consider planes flying into buildings that would take place. And a new threat really over the last few years is biological issues. What if somebody identifies suspicious white powder? How do you deal with that? You go over and taste it and see if it's anthrax? What are you going to do? So a lot of companies they may have issue to deal with a tornado, but they don't necessarily have thought about, well, if there's a biological threat, if there's a disgruntled employee, if there's some type of terrorism. You can't protect yourself from everything, but the more that you could think about the possible threats and the preventive measures you could put in place, the better luck your company has to actually survive. So now we need to actually calculate the risk for each function, because up to now we've been gathering data, identifying which is the critical functions that need to be up and running for the company, what resources that each function requires. We calculated the MTD, the maximum tolerable downtime for each of these resources. We looked at vulnerabilities and threats, and now we need to kind of put all of that information together and assign risks, which was really about figuring out how critical the different resources and the functions are to be able to create that hierarchy. What has to come up first, what has to come up second, what has to be in place for the first critical function to come up. The actual way to do this is you could do, a lot of times it's a mix between qualitative and quantitative, because you have to calculate the amount of revenue that would be lost in certain situations, the amount cost for recovery, the amount that it would cost for getting things up and running. So a lot of times there's actually a mix. You use those quantitative values to help you figure out the qualitative rating. And we talked in Domain 1 the difference between quantitative and qualitative. And quantitative is doing a risk analysis looking at monetary values, probability, using actual numbers, percentages, monetary numbers. And qualitative is like a scenario based. You're using a rating system like 1 through 10 or 1 through 5 or green, yellow, red. So the team has to gather all this information, and then they'll determine the probability of a threat becoming real and the level of impact that that's going to create. So that should all be documented, and they're going to make these probability ratings and the impact ratings on the data that they collected before. Now, of course, you can't necessarily read the future, because that's what risk analysis and risk management is all about. But you can look at what's happened in the past. There's also data that's available by local and federal government on types of natural disaster that's happened in the past, and the type of company you are. The type of company that you are and what you actually do will help determine, through a threat analysis, determine what type of, if you're a bank, then you're going to have people who are more determined to do something. If you're a government agency, then you're going to have more somebody more determined to carry out some type of disaster. So a lot of this information will go into coming up with the necessary rating system. Now it's up to the organization, the team, how they're going to put these ratings together. But as we saw in Domain 1, a very useful, simplistic, and commonly used approach is to have the 4 quadrants. And the top is usually red, which has the highest likelihood, highest impact. And that means that's what we have to make sure is up and running. We have to make sure that we have resources and backup solutions, and all of them will fall into these boxes, and they give us a roadmap into what we have to make sure is taken care of first. So basically what we're going to do, and what we've kind of talked about up to now, is we're going to identify a business process. For example, we have timesheets. Well, what resources are needed for processing timesheets for payment? Well, the resources would be software, LAN servers. You'd have a whole list of resources. Okay, great. So for the LAN server itself, how long can we go with it being down? That's the impact. What's the duration that it can actually be down before we can't survive that impact? So we'll take that resource, we'll look at the impact and calculate MTD, and then we assign it a rating to determine how critical it is that LAN server has to come up before, you know, an email server or a web server. Now, when you look at the actual potential losses, it depends, of course, company to company. Smaller companies can be down for a longer period of time, potentially, and it depends upon how dependent you are. If you have people coming into your store, let's say, and they're purchasing things, and there's functions you can carry out manually, then you're not going to be as dependent upon technology versus the larger companies that have all of their revenue come through e-commerce. Then they're going to be greatly hurt if they lose power, if they lose communication, if they lose those servers. So when you look at the actual estimates that are out there, it could be amazing, like 6.5 million per hour for a brokerage operation, 2.6 million per hour for a credit card sales authorization system. So if the team doesn't do their job right, and something does not, all the stuff that's necessary doesn't come up within an hour, the company can actually lose $2.6 million every single hour. So these are the figures that the team needs to understand. And again, it's not just about the revenue, although that's a big part, especially for for-profit organizations, but the team needs to realize there's other things they have to make sure that they're compliant to, which is the regulatory compliance, which is becoming a bigger driver all the time, the reputation of if you go down and you can't sustain the services or the products that you're supposed to provide. So these are all the risk components that need to be evaluated. So let's take a step back here and see what we've already gone through. We've talked about the project initiation phase, and there the first thing that has to happen is that we have to have management support. That's critical. Management support has to be solidified in the project initiation phase, because really, if they don't buy off on it, it's not going to be done. It takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of time, and usually what I said is that people already have other jobs, and they're assigned this responsibility. So if you don't have their buy-in, you can have very good intentions, but it won't be a complete or useful plan. So we've talked about what has to happen in the project initiation phase. We talked about the policy, development of the policy, which is a high-level overview, which are management's directives of what's supposed to happen here. We line out the scope, we line out the roles and responsibilities, and it's a high-level thing that's going to give us direction. We come up with a BCP coordinator. We put the team together, which is representatives of different parts of the organization. We've identified the critical functions for the company. We've identified the resources that these critical functions need. We've calculated the MTD values for each of these resources. So again, what's kind of frustrating when you're teaching BCP or really anything like this, it seems as though it's straightforward, and it seems as though since we cover it so quickly, and you could see nice, clear bullet line items that it's easily accomplished, but it's not. Mainly because companies are so large, they're so complex, that a lot of these are not easily accomplished, but we have to do the best we can. So once the team does all that we've talked about, now they need to come up with recovery strategies, because basically they've got all the data they need. We've got to protect this. This thing needs these pieces. These pieces can only be down for this amount of time, and that correlates to, great, we have to have these type of recovery solutions. So we've got to have identified the backup solutions and the tolerance outage times, which we'll talk about. Now, the recovery solutions, it's not so easy as we got to get the network up and running, or we've got to get the web servers running, or we have to get the server running, or we have to get the people in place. The recovery strategies actually go for specific really components that are necessary for every business function, because you're going to have a business process recovery. And this is what a lot of people kind of miss, is business process recovery, because that's what a critical function is. It's actually a business process. And so we're going to step through what a business process is, what it means to set up recovery strategy for that. We'll look at facility recovery solutions, supply and technology, user environment recovery, and data recovery. So again, this is not only a good review for the CISSP exam, but because a lot of people aren't skilled in knowing how to do this, carry out and create a very substantial and useful plan, these are very good kind of steps to chop up how to protect the company overall. So one of the first things that we need to understand in our recovery approach is how to recover a business process. And usually for us techies, it's harder to kind of comprehend what is a business process, what's all involved with it. And a lot of techies kind of blow that off. We think that everything needs technology, and we need to worry about the network and server, and somebody else will figure the other part out. But when we're looking at a BCP, developing it, it has to be holistic. It has to be understanding how the company works, along with the supporting components, and one of them is technology. So understanding how to recover a business process means that you understand what the business process is. And so, for example, if our company made toasters, the business process would be accepting an order, accepting payment, sending that on to inventory, pulling out the necessary toaster and making the documentation. It goes to shipping. Shipping gets it off to the customer. That's a very simplistic example, but you see that there's actual individual steps, that each one of those steps, if something fails, really the whole business process fails. So we have to understand, when we identify the critical functions, that means we identify the critical business processes that cannot be interrupted, or if they are interrupted, how do we get those components back online so the process can continue. And more people are have been getting more familiar with the business process, because a lot of the regulations that have recently come down has required businesses to actually document their processes. Like in SOX, that was a huge thing in SOX. You had to actually document your processes to be able to figure out where the financial data is being created, stored, and where it's going. So the security industry is being forced to understand more about business process documentation, but really you can't recover business if you don't understand its business processes. So that's the first thing, is to be able to document it, understand where the threats or vulnerabilities are, so you know what type of recovery solutions have to be in place so the business process can finish. So the team must understand, specific critical business processes, and that will what roles are involved, who actually needs to carry out this to complete the process, what resources. We have customer service, we have our transaction, maybe our credit card transactions, we have our communication links, and they're usually laid out in a workflow manner, and a lot of times there's a lot of workflow products that lay all this out, and each process has an input and an output, and that's not only is it important to know the input and output, but how those steps happen, and how the different processes interface. That's where we come up with the interdependencies. So again, I keep stressing this, but it's a complex thing to be able to understand how a whole business works, how the steps within each process works, and then how the resources that support it and the interdependency. It's becoming more important in the industry. It's getting hit more on the test. So some of this stuff seems intuitive to people, and so they kind of, that makes sense, workflow and business process and that type of thing. But you'll get questions that will be much trickier than how I'm explaining it, because you're actually not only going to need to understand what I'm explaining, but you're going to have to understand how the different pieces work together. And that's what it means to be cognitive, that this is a cognitive test, meaning that you understand how all these pieces work together. So we'll look at several options for how to recover a facility. We have many options that the team needs to be aware of, and how to determine which facility recovery solution is best for this company. So the facility recovery, we can go through a service bureau service that has the hot, warm, cold sites. We'll talk about the non-reciprocal agreements, redundant sites, hot rolling sites, multi-processing centers. We'll talk about what's all available, and it's up to the team to understand how much the company will lose if it's not up and running because of the facility, and that will equate to how much you could spend on an alternate facility to get back up and running. So the common sites that people are familiar with are hot, warm, and cold. And a hot site means that it has all the necessary equipment, the software, everything's there, and the goal is that all you need to do is you come in with your data backups, you load your data, you provide the people, and you're back up and running. A hot site is there to get a company back up and running within an hour or so. And of course it's the most expensive compared to the other two, because all of this equipment is available to you, all of the software is ready to go. One benefit of a hot site is that you could do annual testing. The other sites you can't really do that, but because everything's actually there, you can include it in your annual drills to make sure everything works properly. Now the other type is a warm site, and a warm site means that you'll have the building, you have the electricity, you have the phone system, and you may have some computers or some type of peripheral devices, but the warm site doesn't have all of the computers, all the servers, all the software that's needed. The idea is that you're going to bring this equipment and the software and your data backups and your people along to populate the warm site so you can get up and running. And so a company would not be able to get up and running within an hour or two. A warm site could, take a day or longer to get all the equipment in there, to get everything up and running. So a company would choose a warm site over a hot site if, when they've done their MTD values, they figured out that they could still stay in business if they're not running for 2 or 3 days. So the hot site is the most expensive, warm site is cheaper, and then the cold site is the cheapest, which is, a cold site is just a building. It's just an empty building. It'll have the lines running, like for electricity and HVAC and those phone. It'll have the lines there, but they actually won't be turned on. It's just an empty building. So to actually get a cold site up and running, it'll take at least a week, because you got to get all those services turned on, you got to get all your equipment in there and get it all working and bring in your people and get going. But so it's the cheapest. When you're looking at hot, warm, cold, the cold is the cheapest. So one of the things that the team needs to consider or make sure that's in place is the actual software, the hardware, the backup tapes. All of that is compatible with your off-site facility, because let's say you pay for a hot site facility to be available to you, and so all the systems, all the software is there, and what you need to do is bring in your backup data tapes. Well, what if your tapes don't work with their recovery tape systems? That's a huge issue. So you need to make sure that there's compatibility with your hardware and your software with the off-site facility. And the off-site facility company, the company that's maintaining these facilities and what's inside them, need to tell you if they update something. There's been situations where offsite companies have done a technology refresh, and then when a disaster happens, the company comes and tries to get going, but now there's compatibility issues because the customer, your company, wasn't informed. So being able to properly recover requires compatibility. Now, if you need to ensure that you can recover your data at a hot site, you test your recovery tapes at the hot site. If you need to test the recovery procedures for a warm site, where do you do that? That would be at your own facility, because the goal with a warm site is that you're bringing your systems with you. So if you're using a hot site, make sure to ensure that your backup tapes are compatible with their equipment. And if it's a warm site, make sure that your backup tapes are compatible with your equipment. And then there's, to be extra careful, you can have yet another backup site. And basically that would mean you'd have a primary backup site, and then you'd have a secondary backup site. And the idea is, just in case this primary goes down or it's not available to you, that you actually have another site. But this means that you have to pay for 2 sites to be available to you. And although that's an option, most companies who need to have that much assurance that this is going to be available to them will usually actually have like a redundant site, which we're going to talk about, that's their own. But you need to know that this is an option of having basically a secondary to your primary offsite facility. Now, when we talk about these hot, warm, and cold, it's not just if there's systems or if there's not systems. This is actually a service that you pay for. You pay for it every single month. And so you may never ever have a disaster, but you have to pay for it every single month, so it will be available to you. It's like insurance. And something that a lot of companies don't know, and they could find out only when it's too late, is that more than one customer actually rents out or pays for that site. So you could be paying for a hot site to be available to you. Now, if the disaster is large enough and affects a whole bunch of companies, you can actually, even though you've paid for that hot site, it'll be a first come, first serve. If another company has been paying for that facility, that site, they'll be able to move in and you won't. Now, people say, well, can't you have contracts to say that you're the primary? Well, yeah, you can have contracts that say for anything, of course, but that's kind of that's the one-off. Subscription services just do this. They have several customers that will rent or pay for the same area, because most of them aren't going to all need it at the same time. Now, even if that facility that you've been paying for is not available to you, that company that's maintaining the site may say, oh, we have another site available to you. It's in California, or it's in Wisconsin or something. Well, that's a huge issue, because if you're in Washington, D.C., then you've got to move all of your people. So it's important to know that this is a monthly cost, and it's not just a monthly cost. There's activation cost, means that when you actually move in, it's going to be a higher cost per day, and that it is a first come, first serve. You may be paying for it, but it may not be available to you if enough companies are negatively affected and have paid for the same site. So another option is to set up multi-processing centers, which means that you can have, let's say you have an organization that has data centers or offices, 4 of them within the United States. Well, you could set up a technology where processing is taking place, at their local location. But if one location goes down or something negatively happens, then there's a switch over so the processing can take place at another facility. So that technology is actually quite amazing how quick it happens if it's all set up and tested properly. The switch over from one facility to the other can actually take place within seconds. So where should we have our off-site facility? Should it be next door? Should it be across the street? Where should our off-site facility be? You know, the kind of best practice is that the off-site facility is at least 25 miles away. Because the goal is that if your facility is negatively affected and you have an off-site facility next door or close, then it could potentially be destroyed also. But you don't want your off-site facility to be too far away, because that means that you might have to take all of your systems down there. What about your people? If it's 100 or 200 miles away, you may have to pay for the people's, they have to rent apartments, they have to, for transportation. So not too close, not too far away. But the team has to make the determination and understand the issues of a facility being too close or too far. So another option instead of actually paying for something to be available to you, you can set up a reciprocal agreement. And a reciprocal agreement just means that I tell you, hey, if your company has some problems, you go through a disaster, you come over to our place. You can work in our place until you get back on your feet. And you say, great, same here. You have a problem, disaster, you can come over to our facility and work. And so it's a reciprocal agreement. We both agree that if we experience disasters, then we can work in each other's offices or factories or whatever. Now, it sounds very nice. But the reality is that most organizations actually don't have the space or the processing, extra processing, or the resources to allow another company to actually move in. And reciprocal agreements, by definition, are not enforceable. So I could tell you that, hey, you got a disaster, you come over with us and we'll help you out. But then once you have the disaster, I say, I know speak English. I don't know what you're talking about. You can't come over. So it's not enforceable. It may not be available to you. But the companies that usually carry these things out are the ones that have specialized, usually like equipment, maybe car companies or newspapers. Newspapers have these large devices that do all the printing. They'll have reciprocal agreements because it's very expensive to have a redundant printing machine like that, and that's very specific to that industry. Now, just because you go through a disaster doesn't mean that you're let off the hook of your responsibility of maintaining the confidentiality or access control of sensitive information. Now, it doesn't mean that no matter what, you're going to be found liable. And we talked about in the first domain and in law that you have to basically follow the prudent man rule, which means that you have to do the best you can. You can't protect from everything, and that people know that, the courts know that. But you have to do the best you can. So if you go through a disaster and or some type of an issue, and all of a sudden your firewall's down, but your systems are up and running, and people can get directly into the Social Security numbers, you can be in big trouble. Not only with regulatory agencies, but civil suits will be coming. So you have to think about that. Just because you go through a disaster, you have to think about what is your responsibility or liability to protect specific assets. So, more options for off-site facilities. We talked about hot, warm, cold, reciprocal agreements, multi-processing centers. Another example or resource that's available is a redundant site. And what it means to have a redundant site is there's a whole another facility that the actual company owns. So if your company has a redundant site, you own that facility. You don't have to pay monthly for it to be available to you. You own it, and in most situations it mirrors your production environment. because companies that are actually going to set up a redundant site have gone through the business impact analysis and have figured out that if they're down even maybe less than an hour, that they can go out of business. So even a hot site may not be good enough, or that the actual cost of using a hot site, of all the people that they'll need and the activation costs and everything. So it's always a cost-benefit analysis. But a redundant site means your company owns that environment. Most of the time it's a mirrored environment of your production. And what's difficult is actually keeping it up to date. Because if this is your production environment and you know that changes are happening all the time, you have technical refreshes, you have hot fixes, you have patches, you're adding software. If this is supposed to be a mirrored environment that you're supposed to be able to go right into and get back to work, that has to be constantly updated also. So the redundant site is the most expensive option out of all of the offsite recovery solutions, but expensive is relative because it's a cost-benefit solution, and the company has figured out if we don't have a redundant site, we're history. So another example that can help you in these dire situations is a rolling hot site. And really what this is it's like a big semi-truck that's going to pull up. A lot of times it'll pull up into the parking lot of the organization that just had a disaster. It's a big truck, and the truck is already wired. There's a network in there, there's workstations. A lot of times it's wirelessly already connected to the internet. So it rolls up, your people get in, and they start working. They start doing their processing. And insurance companies have these rolling hot sites that they'll deploy for companies that go through disasters. The military also uses these rolling hot sites, which are just large trucks that are already wired for processing. So we've talked about the business process recovery. You need to understand the business process and the steps and know what can negatively affect it so that you can put the right resources in to make sure that the process carries out even after a disaster. We talked about the facility recovery. That would be hot site, warm site, cold site, reciprocal agreement, rolling hot site, redundant. So there's all these solutions, there's all these possibilities. Now we'll quickly look at supply and technology recovery. What has to be in place for this? So the actual supplies and the technology that are required will be different for every company. It'll be different, potentially per business function. But what we mean here is what are the resources, what are the computers, what are the software, what are the human resources that are needed. And human resources is one of the most commonly overlooked resource when teams are putting together these plans. That's because they're so focused on usually something hardware, the network or the servers or the facility, or and what's forgotten about is, oh yeah, we need people like to run this stuff. So that's commonly left out of the plan or not given enough importance. So we need to look at do we need transport? How do we transport the people and the equipment? The data. How are we protecting and recovering our data? What type of forms and cabling and documentation? There's a whole list, and when the team actually identified their critical function, they had to identify the resources. But then there's a lot of smaller things which would be considered supplies that are easily forgotten about. And companies experience that when they go through a disaster. They forgot about this, that, another thing, and that usually delays coming back up in line, or it costs more money because you have to go and buy whatever it is you forgot. Now more and more companies are moving to voice over IP, and we talked about that in telecommunications, where traditional networks within companies have a voice network and then an IP network. And now we're starting to combine them where voice will be going over in packets, so you combine the two networks into one. Sounds great. It could be cheaper for a lot of things. It could be easier to maintain, but it's a single point of failure, meaning that you only have one network. So if the network actually goes down, not only do you lose your ability to transfer data, you lose your ability to actually communicate. And during a disaster, a lot of times communication is a higher priority, especially during the disaster recovery procedures, than maybe the data processing. So in environments that have voice over IP, they need to ensure that there's some backup way of communication. Now, I talked about one of the requirements is to understand what hardware you're going to need, what equipment you're going to need, and we said that in a warm site, the goal is that you're going to bring your stuff with you. You're going to bring your systems and your equipment and your software and everything with you. Now, there of course can be times where you can't bring it with you because it's all been destroyed, or maybe half of it's been destroyed. So you need to ensure that your vendors can properly supply you with the equipment that you need. But here's something that a lot of companies have run into. They'll have, they've got their vendor, Gateway, Dell, whatever, laid out who can supply them with, the necessary hardware. But can they provide you with 100 computers in 3 days? A lot of companies have actually laid out, we've got our vendor, no big deal, but they haven't communicated with the vendor on how quickly that equipment can get to that environment. So things would start falling apart because they don't have it in place. So you need to review your SLAs, your service level agreements with the vendors, because in a lot of situations you're not going to necessarily have redundancy of everything. For example, if you're T1, you'll have the telecommunication company will have an SLA, meaning that if it's down, if it goes down, then they're going to recover it or give you another option within whatever, 24 hours. And so you have to make sure that that's comparable to your MTD. Make sure that 24 hours falls within your MTD value. So reviewing the service level agreements to ensure that your suppliers can do what you need them to do in this type of situation is critical. Now, even if your suppliers can get you the necessary equipment, are they going to bring the exact same equipment that you're using right now? Is it going to be updated? Is it going to be a different version? And again, this is something that companies have run into. They had all, a certain type of server or a certain type of workstations, and then they get from their vendor, they get something that's new. There's something different with the processor. There's something different with the drivers, and there's not compatibility. So it's not necessarily something that the team can control. They don't know when a disaster is going to happen. They don't know when there's going to be a refresh or update to the technology. But this has to be identified, because if that's going to be a risk, the company has a couple options. Either you have your own supply, so you buy all of these systems and all this equipment and you just keep it in case of a rainy day, in case everything blows up, or you ensure that your operations doesn't require that it has to be a specific processor or it has to be a specific something. It'll be more generic. So we went through some of the resources that the team has to make sure that has been covered, human resources, and it's not like you say we need to make sure Bob is doing whatever. It's you have to understand what skill set is needed to carry out what functionality, because those people may not be available, they may have gotten injured, so it's a skill set that you'll need to understand, not necessarily calling out an individual. We talked about replacement hardware, understanding the service level agreements from the vendors and make sure that they match up with the MTD values. We've talked about proprietary devices and software, which could be a risk because they can't be easily replaced, if replaced at all. And then another issue is that when the company experiences some type of disaster, then looting and fraudulent activities could take place. Now, the team that's developing the plan may, find out that they really can't do anything about potential looting or fraudulent, like people stealing and stuff, because all of their resources are, stretched to actually get the company maybe up and going at another facility. But it's important to think about or be aware of these possibilities, and there's potential controls that can be put in place. One thing I said was that one of the most forgotten about resource is human resources, the people themselves. Now, if the disaster is large enough to affect a wide area, do you think that the employees are going to be showing up at work every day? They're going to be loyal to the company when their house has already been destroyed or their family's been injured? And that's something else that teams usually don't think about. They think that they've got to get back up and running, and their employees or whoever they need will be there. But if there's been a large enough disaster, the people have responsibilities to their family, and that's what they'll deal with first. So they may not be available to the company to start getting back to work. Now, there could be another missing piece, not only just the employees. We could actually lose, the CEO or CIO or somebody at top management. And a lot of larger companies have to worry about this, even not necessarily a disaster. For example, like the president, the vice president, they're not allowed to go on the same plane, because if the plane goes down, we've lost both. And large corporations do the same thing, is that their CEO and another C-level person who's very important, they can't go in the same place, or they shouldn't be at the same they wouldn't be on the same plane, or they shouldn't be at the same place, because they'd be putting themselves both at risk, which would actually put the company at risk. So there needs to be something laid out. This is for business continuity, but companies should do this anyway, is that if the CEO, maybe he left his job, he's unavailable, if there was a disaster, maybe he actually got killed, who's going to be the replacement? And a lot of companies actually have a deputy, like deputy CEO, which means this is the person who's going to step into the place of the CEO if something happens to him. They have a deputy CFO. But if they don't have these deputies already decided upon, if it's a public company, then the board will actually make the decision of who's going to step up and run the company, especially in this type of situation, before everything settles down and they have to find a new leader. We talked about business process recovery, facility recovery, supply and technology recovery, and now we'll just quickly look at the user environment recovery issues. If you think about it, the user environment is like one of the most important, because they're the ones who's carrying out the tasks. So to be able to reconstruct the necessary network or the resources, that means you have to understand it. And it may sound silly, but just like most organizations don't understand how they work overall, because there's so many different components that have to come together, a lot of companies actually don't fully understand how their network works. And because when the network was built, usually maybe it started 10 years ago, and then from there it's constantly been built upon, it's constantly gotten bigger. Whoever was there 10 years ago most likely isn't maintaining it now. There's new software, there's new technology. So a lot of companies don't fully understand how their full network works. And what's important is to understand what supplies or what technology of that network that does have to come up. It's not, because you're not going to rebuild the whole network at an offsite facility. You will need to rebuild the network when you go back to the primary facility or your near facility. So The environment needs to be documented. The configurations of software, the network schematic, which is one thing that most companies allowed to go out of date. You've got to understand something if you're going to be in a position to rebuild it. Now the users, they are going to carry out most of the work, so you need to make sure that they can get back to work as soon as possible. And one of the things is to understand some of the tasks that they carry out through automation if they could be done manually. A lot of times you'll need to find some type of manual way that replaces automation until you can get the automation up and running. So then we'll look at the actual data recovery technologies. And as I said, that today really the goal, the assets that companies need to protect is data. And there's several different technologies that can be put in place to be able to back up sensitive data or any type of data and recover it. So the data recovery technologies we'll look at co-location, actual backups, which will be manual and through automation, electronic vaulting, remote journaling, tape vaulting, which could be manual or through automation, clustering, which will actually hit clustering again in operations, and disk shadowing. So we'll walk through each one of these, and you just have to know the basic functionalities of how they work. So co-location just means that you have maybe your software, your operations, your processing is going on at another location. Maybe you're kind of renting out a rack space or servers, and you're maintaining that software. And that you would do that because wherever your software is running, wherever that data processes is happening, that's a secure location. Usually it's a facility specifically for this, where it's, it's very secure, it's got reinforced walls, it's got 24/7 connection, and it just ensures that even if your facility something happens, then that processing is going to continue to take place. In data recovery, we know that we're supposed to back up our data, and there's different ways to do it, and that's what this section's about. Now, if you're going to do manual backups, then you could do full, differential, or incremental, which we go specifically through in operations. But the full backup is just what it sounds like. You're backing up all the data. Differential is you're doing a backup since the last full backup. Incremental means you're doing a backup since the last backup, no matter what it is. So if you'd have a full backup and then you did differential, that would be the deltas or the changes since the last full backup. If you do incremental, then you could have a full backup and then do a backup like every week. And what it would do is just capture the changes, the deltas that happen every week. So in an incremental, you have to lay down, recover the full backup, and then you have to put all the incrementals on top of each other in sequence to get back to the date or the proper version of the data itself. So the backups themselves need to be properly protected, whether they be on-site, but they really should be off-site. And there's been a lot of stories in the news about different companies losing its sensitive data, and it could definitely happen through backup tapes. Companies have lost thousands of account information because their backup tapes got lost or stolen. Now the type of data that gets backed up and the frequency of it getting backed up depends upon the sensitivity of the data, which has to be laid out by the company. And you have to say where is this data going to be that's going to get backed up. Usually it's like the critical servers. If there's user information that needs to be backed up, they can either back up from their workstations, or the users have to put all their information on a specific server that'll be backed up. So this process of what gets backed up, how often, and the different types needs to be laid out by the company, but within BCP, you have to make sure that that's actually happening. Because since data is the core, that's the most important, we need to make sure it's protected, but you also need to test that you can recover it. Because there's been companies that have backed up data, and they never tested if they can actually recover it. And I think one of the most interesting stories I heard was a company had a courier service. Basically, they do their backup tapes, and then a courier would come and pick them up and take them to the off-site facility for storage. Well, the courier actually was going through a subway, and a subway really has all these large motors which create their own magnetic force, and it scrambled some of their data. And they didn't know that for like 3 years because they never had to recover any data. They didn't test it. And when they actually needed to, they found out a lot of their data had actually been corrupted. So it's not just manual recovery. If you have automation, you need to test it to make sure that, yeah, you can get your data back. So, like I said, the type of data, when we went through in Domain 1, we talked about information classification and how the data owner has to classify data. And it's not just based on the secrecy or the level of confidentiality that's needed for the data, it's how important that data is to the company. So the data itself should actually be classified based on how important it is to the company, and then you can lay out your backup schedule based on that. You can lay out what data you're going to back up, how often. So there's two types of automated backup technologies we need to know about. The first is electronic vaulting. And this is really kind of an older technology where let's say that at our location we have a database, and at the off-site facility that's storing our data, there's another database that's holding the exact same information. Now, when our database has some changes to the files, it doesn't happen automatically. They don't sync up automatically. If it's electronic vaulting, what happens is all of the changes, those files that are actually changed, will be transferred over in a batch process, and then they will update that data over there. So this is a batch process where changes would go over maybe at the end of the day, the end of the week, and then update the data at the other location. And this is older because in most situations we don't have to do the batch processing. Our technology now allows us to do real-time synchronization. So the real-time synchronization is remote journaling. And instead of actually moving the whole files over, basically what happens is on our database there's a transaction log, and it will log what changes take place to the information. And then that transaction log will go over to the offsite facility where our data is being stored, and that software would use that transaction log to know how to update that data. And that can happen in real time versus batch processing, and that's better because if we're doing batch processing, then there's a window of time that we could lose a whole bunch of data. If we don't do our backup, or we don't move that file over until the end of the week, there's a potential we lose a whole week of data changes. Now, I said that we could back up our data on tapes, and this can happen through a manual process where you just back up on tapes, and then they really should be stored in an off-site facility, or it can happen through automation where your changes, your backups actually go over like a telecommunication line, and they're stored at another location on their tapes. So usually tape vaulting, what we're talking about the actual automation process of storing it at another location. Now, what's important, not only for the real world, but for this exam also, is that whoever is maintaining your data, whether it's in tape form, it's in just in a database, or however you're doing your backups, whatever company is storing it, it's important that your company, really understand the level of protection that's being provided, and that includes access control, the actual environment, the humidity, the temperature, because that data needs to be secured at the level of protection that you're providing for it in your environment. So you need to make sure that this other company that you're paying to protect your data is actually meeting all of the requirements to protect your data at the level it needs to be. Another thing to think about is, when is this data available? Because if it's available only Monday through Friday, 8 through 5, and you have a disaster and you have to start rebuilding over the weekend, how do you get access to it? So when can you actually gain access to this data? So you don't just want to pay a company, you really want to understand where the stuff is being stored, how it's being protected. So I talked about the compatibility issues when you're at an off-site facility. Now, if you're going to use a warm site facility, what do you need to make sure your tape backups are compatible with? If you're going to use a warm site, you need to make sure that your tape backups are compatible with your hardware, because the idea is that you're going to bring your hardware with you because the warm site doesn't have any. If it's a hot site, what do you need to make sure that your tape backups are compatible with? Their hardware, because you're going to use their hardware to recover your data and get back to work. Now, another example is for fault tolerance, really not for backups, but fault tolerance would be clustering. And we covered clustering in telecommunications. And a lot of people think of clustering as mainly for LAN environments, but it could be used for LAN, WAN, or MAN environments. And what clustering means is you've got basically software that's controlling software on all of these different devices or servers. If you think about a server farm for e-commerce environment, you've got this whole server farm, which means a whole bunch of different servers that are running the same software, the same web software, and basically it's doing load balancing, which means that there's a piece of software that knows how busy each one of those devices are, and it will send, this guy's not as busy, I'll go ahead and send the next request to him. Now, clustering in this, what we're talking about in business continuity, is that it provides, it reduces your point of failure. If you only had one thing and you didn't have clustering, or if you had several servers and they weren't clustered, that meant when that one server went down, whatever it provided, whatever functionality would not be available. In clustering, if one server goes down, the others are going to continue to work and continue to provide that functionality. Now, disk shadowing and disk mirroring, in reality there is a difference in the technology, but the exam actually treats them basically the same at the level that you need to know for the CISSP exam. For example, disk mirroring means you have at least 2 hard drives, and when the data is backed up, it's going to go to both drives. That's what disk mirroring is. So you have 2 drives with the exact same information. Disk shadowing is basically the same thing. Again, the technology is a little bit different, but on the exam they don't really go that deep into it. And then what you need to know is the reason for doing this. Why would you carry out disk mirroring or shadowing? And that's because if one drive goes down, then you have the other drive. It's about redundancy and fault tolerance. And in operations we talk about a RAID system, which can also provide fault tolerance as long as you have parity being used. Parity is the information that is stored that rebuilds the data if you lose a drive. So great, these all sound like great solutions, so why don't we just buy it all? Or which ones do we need to buy? That's a very confusing question, especially when you have all these different options. The decision has to come down to the result really of what has been carried out, the information that's already been carried out based on the business impact values. Like we talked about, that we've understand the NTD values, that how long resources can be down, and that will determine which type of data backup and restore solution that's going to be in place based on how bad it's going to hurt our company the longer we are without data. So it's kind of an interesting balancing act to be able to figure out the recovery point objective. And the CISSP exam doesn't really use that terminology, recovery point objective. It sticks to MTD more. Recovery time objective means that there's, it's basically the same thing. When do you actually have to get things back up and running? But an interesting part of this recovery time objective is that realizing actually getting back up and running, that's expensive, because you're going to spend a lot of money getting back up and running. And so it's not just what your company is going to lose in revenue as it's down, it's also how much are you going to have to spend to get back up and running. So that some teams have kind of missed that and just looked at the MTD value and says, we've got to be running up in so many hours, we need to have this in place. Well, how much is this going to cost you, and how much is it going to cost you when you actually have to put it in action? So even though that the developing this plan can be complex, it increases in complexity in that the more that we're involved with the web, the more dependent we are with internet connection and e-commerce, and the level of diversity within our environments, our wireless connections, and all of the different types of devices. So the actual resources and the time and solutions is actually getting more complex of how to properly get things up and going. But in the industry, there's a lot more products to be able to get things up and going in a streamlined fashion that there were before. So if you look at this graphic, I think it's very interesting that this is how you understand what type of technology you would put in place. The recovery time means how fast do we have to get back up and running. Recovery point actually means how long or how much data can we go without. Now, the CISSP exam doesn't go as much into the recovery point. You would see this, though, if you're in this industry or if you had to develop a business continuity plan. You need to know when you have to be up and running. It means an hour, 2 hours, however, based on the amount of revenue usually you're going to lose. But also how much data can we lose. That has more to do with the recovery point, meaning that we can't lose any data, which means we have to have synchronous, constant backup. It has to be in real time. Now, if we could afford to lose maybe a day's worth of data, of backup information, changes to our original, the original data we have. If that can go for a day, then we could do our backups maybe in a batch job at the end of the day. But so understanding when you have to come back up and how much data you can or can't lose really comes into the equation of figuring out what solutions need to be put in place. So again, the CISSP exam really kind of sticks to MTD values, which is what's important to you, maximum tolerable downtime. And you'll need to know that that you have to be able to understand that the longer that you're able to be down, the cheaper the resources or the solutions you need. If you have to be up and running all the time, that's of course going to be more expensive. But in the industry, because the exam just goes really 1 inch deep, in the industry they get down even deeper into specific timelines and amount of data that can actually be lost and that type of stuff. But the CISSP usually stays a little bit higher at the MTD values. So we would like to be able to actually reduce the impact of any type of disaster that could take place, which means we have to be proactive and not just reactive once something bad happens. As I said when we were kind of going through the steps of the business impact analysis, it's one thing to find a backup recovery solution for a specific resource, a server, a communication link, your data. But those are for specific resources. You have to come up with a solution that connects all of these pieces together to make sure that the critical functions are up and running. So it may be actually, not too hard to be able to come up with a duplicate or another T1 or another a power feeder coming in through a different substation, or come up with the type of electronic data that backup that you're going to use for recovery. But to come up with all of those pieces actually have to fit together and work together, which gets more complex. So the recovery solutions for the whole company, again, you have to understand the company and the functions that that is relied upon in the business processes. And I talked about this Ackman model, which really can help to ensure that you've covered all your pieces. It doesn't mean you're going to cover everything in this model, all the little squares, but what it does is it's kind of a good checklist, or kind of a good thing to make sure that, yeah, we've thought about that, yes, we've thought about that, so that all the pieces actually do work together. Because if you miss, one piece, it could negatively affect standing at the company. So during this exercise of identifying all of this information, gathering information through surveys, finding out what resources are needed, it would be a better idea to actually put some preventative measures in place instead of just waiting for a disaster to happen. So if you figure out that a server would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour if it goes down, then you put in something. You put in a preventive measure, which could be a redundant server. It could be you can have a hot swappable drive. So you can have more than one communication line. You can have duplicate let's say devices. Maybe you have one device actually working and then one stored in case it goes down. So you want to put a UPS and have generators and the type of things that will protect the data. So again, it's all about, bad things are going to happen. You can't control that, but you can control how bad it's going to hurt you. That's what preventative measures are about. So another piece that really needs to be looked at and has been hit more in the exam is the insurance that's required. And this is another thing that this team needs to look at. How much insurance do we have? What is it actually covering? Do we need more insurance? Because a lot of times, a company will actually buy insurance for these types of issues, but then the company expands, it buys another company, it merges, and it doesn't necessarily go back to insurance policies to make sure it's covering these other parts. So one of the responsibilities of the team that's developing the BCP is to review the insurance and make sure it maps to the needs of the company. So really, a majority of this that we've talked about, and a majority of the developing this plan is the business impact analysis. And that's really all the pieces that we've gone through. You're going to need to know those for the exam, the actual steps, what happens at each step, the different types of solutions that are, recovery solutions and backup solutions and preventative solutions. But in real life, what happens is after the team gathers all this information and they figure out what the weaknesses are, the threats, they come up with potential solutions. Now they bring it to management. You bring all of your data to management because they have to make the decision because they're writing the check. So at the end of a business impact analysis, it goes to management, and they're going to have to approve of the solutions that your team has suggested because they're going to have to allocate the resources. Or a lot of times they ask for the team members to go and get some more information about this, that, or another thing before they actually make their decision. everything that we've talked up to now, we actually haven't developed a plan. Nobody has even touched a plan yet. We talked about a policy, which is a high-level management directives. We talked about business impact analysis, implementing preventive controls, coming up with recovery strategies. But once the management approves it, that's when we move into actually developing the plan itself. So the business continuity plan has a specific structure that you can go by. It's easier to go by what other people have used and what's used in best practices. And that means that we've got it split up into like activation phase, recovery phase, reconstitution phase. And we're going to go through each one of those phases and what they mean and what needs to happen. But some things shouldn't be in this plan, or at least publicly available. And that would be like your contact lists of the individuals. You do need to have a contact list when you do need to notify people, but that shouldn't be made public because then people can carry out social engineering attacks more easily. Your actual recovery procedures, you don't want to make that public because somebody can figure out what you're going to do and they're going to try to come in and circumvent or ensure that you can't actually recover properly. So that shouldn't be available. And your results, your actual results of your business impact analysis. So there's parts of this that you don't want to release to the public. So we'll go through each one of the pieces or the components that should be in the plan itself. Now, actually developing the plan can be done more easily if you have a tool through automation. And there's tools out there that can step you through. They actually could step you through the processes up to now, where they have like they have questionnaires that people have to fill out, and they will the tool will gather this data. It could put it through the calculator or the data that it's captured. It could put it through different types of scenarios. It could do reports on the financial issues and the operational impacts. They'll have forms and templates, and the plan itself needs to be properly protected through permissions, meaning that not everybody can access it, which a lot of these products have. And the products also, some of these products have regulatory compliancy issues, which indicate which regulation requires this type of thing to be put in place. So the first part of the plan we'll look at is roles and responsibilities. Now, we talked about a team being developed earlier, but that was the team to actually develop and carry out the business impact analysis. Now we're looking at when a disaster actually happens, how does recovery take place, who does what, and so there's different teams that need to be set up. A damage assessment team, that could be one or more of individuals who's going to assess the damage and determine if the plan needs to be activated. Because it's not like there's, a big boulder comes through the ceiling and then all of a sudden everybody knows what to do and they jump into business continuity procedures. Somebody's going to have to do the assessment, and we're going to walk through that to say, yep, we need to actually pull out the plan and do what it says. A legal team needs to be involved, recovery teams for like your network or specific types of technologies. A restoration team needs to be able to get the new facility. If you're going to an off-site facility, it needs to go and get that facility up and ready so that the workers can come in and start working. And there's a salvage team. The salvage team is actually responsible for getting the primary site up and running. Now, it may be that the primary site's going to be fixed or rebuilt, or you have to have a whole new site, but that's what the salvage team is responsible for. Now, you also have to have somebody who's responsible for communicating to outside entities, so ensure that the right PR is going on. And most large organizations already have these statements that are already printed up for different situations, like if sensitive data got released, or there's been a disaster, or there's been some security breach. most of them have these statements already typed up and have been approved by their legal team, and then you appoint somebody who is to speak to the media or speak to the customers, because you don't want the wrong information to get out. You know, I mean, you don't want an employee to say, yeah, we don't have any business continuity plan, we're destroyed, I got to look for another job. You want the right information to come out to the media, and it's important actually not to just be quiet. Some companies freak out and they don't actually communicate while they're trying to figure their stuff out, and that makes things more suspicious, and it's, you know, that nobody's sure if you're actually going to come back up in business or what's going on. So it's important to communicate, be honest, and actually say something and not let the media come up with their own story. So what is the activation phase? What does that actually mean? Well, activation is this phase or component of the plan lays out how the team, the different teams involved, need to activate or really kind of say, yep, we're going into the phase of implementing our business continuity plan. So that means that somebody has to do a damage assessment. Somebody has to figure out how much damage has been done, how much more damage can be take place, and then start notifying personnel and start deploying the teams. So there's at least one, and possibly two individuals who are identified to carry out the damage assessment. And they're not just going to look around and say, yeah, things look bad. Let's do this thing that says what it lays out on this piece of paper. There's like a criteria that they're going to go through to make the determination, because like I said earlier, there's a difference between a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity plan. Some disasters or things that come up, you could just use the procedures and the disaster procedure plan, which is different than a BCP. BCP means we are in danger for a longer period of time. We have to figure out how to get things up and running. It's not just fixing a little thing, it's actually changing and fixing several things or getting them up and running in another location. So whoever's going to do the damage assessment will, you know, what's the cause? What's the potential for the damage that can still happen? What's the actual effect to the critical functions? What, you know, resources have to be up? And they should understand what the critical resources or what the critical functions are of the company, because how would they make a determination? They need to understand the critical functions and the resources beforehand, because that is what they use, that knowledge, to help determine if they have to activate the plan. So still in this activation phase, once there's a determination, yep, we have experienced a big disaster, we have to activate this business continuity plan, the personnel need to be told, they need to be notified. And, you know, it's different if they're at work, notifying them, versus after hours notifying them. And there's actually products that will do this all through automation. You basically plug in everybody's phone number, their cell number, their pager number, and you will have it all lined up, who gets called, how they get contacted, and sometimes then it'll be just automated recording. You know, somebody picks up their cell phone and it'll say, we've gone through a disaster, you need to report at X, Y, and Z. So the people need to be notified, and on what, you know, this is where we're at, this is where you need to go, and it start kind of herding the cats to be able to get the teams together to get the construction or moving the business to another site. So it's after a damage assessment and the criteria, activation criteria is met, which means that the business continuity team, or whoever is responsible for developing this plan, actually has to develop the criteria And it's best if whoever's going to carry out this damage assessment is involved with developing the criteria, because they will know what this really means versus, you know, if something bad happened, you just give some guy a piece of paper and say, hey, you decide what we're going to do now. It's better if they were involved and they're more intimate in this process. Also within the activation phase is emergency response, and this has to do with safety issues of dealing with people that are hurt. You know, people need to be trained and identified who knows CPR. You have to have first aid information, know how to respond to different types of things, who's going to contact the authorities. That needs to be laid out before waiting for, you know, something bad to happen. This all needs to be laid out, and how to deal with different situations. Maybe there's a gas leak, or there's a fire. So somebody has to be responsible for understanding how to deal with these different emergency situations. So we went through the activation phase, the things that need to take place, a damage assessment, a notification of personnel, and then the emergency response. The next phase is called the recovery phase. Now, there's actually a difference between a recovery phase and a reconstitution phase. The recovery phase is after the disaster happens. Now we need to get back up and working. And the recovery phase could be that how do we get to a new facility, how do we get to the hot site, how do we get to the redundant site. So the recovery procedures is all about getting back up and running. And there should be procedures that are actually documented that people need to follow. And this is a complex thing, because it's not like everybody could just go in and put all their pieces together. Most things have to happen in a sequence. You know, you have to lay down this technology, you have to coordinate this type of skill, you have to get these types of supplies together. So recovery procedures can be very complex, and if it's chaotic and it's confusing and people don't know what they're doing, you're really going to lose a lot of time, which usually equates to revenue. So since the recovery phase is usually complex, because there's a lot of people doing different things, there's different teams, there's responsibilities, so it's best if you have this all laid out, the recovery steps already laid out. This team, who is this team? What exactly do they need to do in what sequence? And then once it happens, they report to a centralized place. Now, if it's a large company, it's a large disaster, then they'll set up like a command post. And as the teams finish their recovery activities, they'll report up, okay, done with this. And then somebody will keep track of it. Because some of the things have to be really in sequence, and they may not be together. So there needs to be some type of a centralized entity. If it's a large disaster, a large company, there would be some type of a command post. If it's a smaller company, then that could be like a coordinator to keep, you know, all the things. One person has to know all the activities that are being successfully carried out or forgotten. So the recovery phase says, hey, we just had a disaster, we need to fix things, we need to get back up and running. Now the reconstitution phase is after the disaster, and we need to go back home now. Now we need to go back to our primary site. So in this phase, we go from dealing with a disaster. Somebody does a assessment, says, yep, we have to actually activate the BCP. We activate the BCP. Then we go into the recovery phase, which is getting the hot site up, or the cold site, whatever thing we're using, getting the data backups, getting the necessary equipment, all of that. And companies may work in the recovery phase for a day, a week, a year. It depends on how long it takes them to get to the reconstitution phase, which is where they actually move from their alternate site back into either their primary site or the new facility that had to be built for them. And it's important to know that a company actually is not out of an emergency state until they get everything back to that original or primary site and get back up and running like things were before. Because if a company is at a off-site facility, they're working in a crippled state. It's not like all of your employees are working and you have all of your resource going. You're working with like a slimmed down resource, slimmed down staff, and usually a revenue stream goes down and you're at risk. The company's at risk because it's not very fortified. So that it's not out of an emergency state until it gets back into its primary site and things are fixed and back up and running. So when we go back to the main facility, we need to ensure the safety for the employees, that the environment, which includes the power, the electricity, the water, all of that's working properly. And this is the salvage company, or the salvage team. That's what they're responsible for, making sure that the primary site is up and running and ready to be moved into, that the connectivity is running, that the environment has been tested, instead of just putting all the pieces together and say, yeah, move on in. You have to test all of the networks, the systems, all of that. So going back to the original site, who do you send back first? I mean, it's not like everybody just moves back into the facility. Who goes in first? Well, the least critical function moves back into the original facility first. Because if the facility is not, if the network's really not working or there's some type of problem, then it won't affect the company if it's the least critical function. So some people get a little bit confused in that after you experience a disaster, the most critical function has to be stood up. But when you return to your main facility or new facility, the least critical function goes back because they're basically the canary, just like with what miners did to test the air. They threw in a canary. If it survived, then it went in. And that's what happens here, is that if everything's working for the least critical function, we'll move everything else in. So just going quickly through the steps of after a disaster hits, what do? Well, we carry out the emergency response procedures, which is if anybody's hurt or we need to get the fire department out. We carry out a damage assessment, which will dictate if we actually need to move into the activation phase, notify management. We declare a disaster. That's where it means you activate the actual plan. You can put a command center together, or you need to identify one central entity that keeps track of all the activities that are going on during the recovery phase. Go to the off-site facility if the disaster is that bad. You have to move to the off-site facility, restore your data, get your employees back to work, and start resuming your critical functions. And then the salvage team goes over to the primary site and starts preparing that for everybody to move back in. So just as we have to properly go into activating the plan, we have to properly terminate the plan. And that may sound kind of goofy. It's like, well, we're done. We don't need the plan anymore. But termination of the plan means that we need to make sure all of the sequences happen properly. Just like there's sequences of setting up the off-site facility, and there's one team has to do one thing, another team has to do another thing, and it works together like this. The same thing is when you move back into the primary facility, a sequence has to happen of how you're going to put the environment, the people, the business processes back together. Because if one of those are missed, which can easily be done because it's complex, then again what happens is the time lapses in how fast you can get back up to processing, which equates to either revenue issues or not being able to provide the service that you're supposed to be providing. So this graphic is it's a very good graphic in that it shows that there's a whole life cycle for the BC plan being created and being maintained, and that it's a circle, it has to be constantly maintained. And then the graphic shows that once an incident occurs, what are those steps, and what decisions have to be made to determine what's the next step. So when you're listening to me go on and on about all of these steps, but it's usually a lot easier, at least for me, to conceptually see a graphic that actually steps through how this works, where the plan has to be created and maintained, but once disaster hits, we go into another phase. Once we put all this work into developing this plan, you think we have a copy of it on the file server at work? Is that where we should store the plan? Well, the plan we should have at least 2 copies, potentially 3, because you need to have one form that's at like an off-site facility that's protected. You have one copy of it on site. A lot of times whoever's the coordinator, like the coordinator who's going to make the damage assessment and such, will have a printout or a plan at their house. So what's the crux is that you don't just have one copy of the BCP and it's stored at the site that may get blown up that you're trying to protect. So now we need to look at the actual drills or exercises that we need to carry out, because it really doesn't make any sense to develop a plan and then just stick it away and nobody actually tests it, which a lot of companies do. You should have no confidence in a plan unless it's been tested, because when you test it is when you're going to find out all the stuff you missed, the stuff that is wrong. So we're going to go through the different types of tests that companies can carry out. So the first test is the checklist test, and this is the most simplistic. And what happens is usually when the plan is finished, its first draft, copies will go out to the department heads and go to management, and they'll go through it and try to eyeball and figure out if the team actually missed things. So they'll make comments, and all the comments will go back to the team will go back to the plan and update it as necessary. Then there's a structured walkthrough test, which means that the department heads and management, people actually come together and they have a meeting and they actually walk through scenarios and see if the plan actually matches and takes care of the threats and the risks that all of these different people can think of or come up with. And there could be more of the brainstorming and walking through a scenario and actually having different perspectives. Simulation test means that now your employees are actually involved and they're actually going to walk through the processes. So they need to understand what the procedures are, where the procedures are, what their responsibilities are. Maybe it's emergency response for people, maybe it's moving servers to an off-site facility, maybe it's getting certain network components up and running. But simulation just means now people are actually walking through the recovery steps. Parallel test really is a simulation test that takes one step further. It's simulation in that the people are walking through the steps, but you actually move some devices or processing over to the alternative off-site facility. So if it's a warm site that you guys are using, then you take some systems over there and see if processing can happen. If you have a redundant site, you'll restore your data and start processing. And the goal is to make sure that move can happen successfully. And there's all these stories of all the things that have gone wrong. And one time, thank goodness, it was during a parallel test, the team was supposed to go to an alternate site and get it all set up. They couldn't find it. They got lost. They didn't know the directions or where the facility actually was. So that's a good thing to figure out so that you know the actual directions of how to get there. Now, the other type of test is a full interruption test, which means all processing is taking place at the alternate facility, whether it be your redundant site, your hot site, whatever. So your whole production shuts down and it starts running somewhere else. And so what do you think? You develop the plan, you just start right off with the full interruption test? Hopefully not. Hopefully you see as you go through these different types of tests, they basically, the checklist is people make sure that you're not missing anything. Simulation people are actually walking through things. Full interruption tests, a lot of companies don't do because it interrupts processing, and it's dangerous. If you don't have everything done correctly, you're actually in danger from testing it. Now, some companies that have to be up and running continuously, like a lot of the large telco companies, will actually do a full interruption test every quarter. So they definitely have things on the ball. So, when you're running your tests, what are you trying to accomplish here? I mean, if you don't know the objectives of your tests, how do you know if you are successful or when you're even done? So you have to have a criteria set out. And the criteria usually is that can we restore these critical devices and processes within this specific time period? So it's can we actually do what we're supposed to, and do we meet the time period that we've calculated, which is the MTD values? So those are the objectives, and you have to have a whole success criteria. And it's going to be much larger than that because you're going to have different things that have to come up in different time periods. So there's going to be a whole sequence. And what will happen, especially in the first few times, is that's where you figure out we forgot about this, or we forgot about that, or somebody doesn't know how to do their part. And that's where the training comes in. The people who you expect to go through, like the simulation or the parallel or the full interruption test, they should know what they're doing. So they should know the purpose of the plan. They should know how to coordinate communication, which is critical in a disaster. How they report, there should be a whole reporting structure, basically through the teams, and there's usually like hierarchy. And again, it depends on the size of the company, but if it's a large company, there'll be a hierarchy, and the people have to know how to communicate up continuously to whoever's coordinated and all, as in a command center. The teams, the people need to know that they're on a specific team, and that may sound funny, but there's been companies that have been audited, and the auditor will get their plan and they'll walk through it, and they'll actually go to individuals who fulfill these specific roles, and the people never knew. They never knew that they were assigned to this role. They didn't know what their responsibilities were supposed to. So basically, they'd be useless in the time of disaster. So people need to know what teams they're assigned to and what their responsibilities are. And the test should be carried out in a manner to realize that you're going to learn something. It does no good to run a test and then get all frustrated because it did not work. That's why you run tests, because you're trying to find the flaws. So you'll find the flaws, the people will get more used to what they're supposed to do, you find the flaws, and you continually improve upon your plan. If you run just one test, that doesn't provide a lot of confidence in the test itself. So if the plan is considered effective if the company can restore and be responsive in the acceptable time frame, which has been laid out in the MTDs. They can actually do their data processing if they have to move to another location. Backups are properly restored. Emergency procedures are carried out. Team members are aware of what they're supposed to do. And this all happens in the right sequence. So again, it sounds very simplistic, but if you've ever been in a situation where not only is there a disaster, but everything has to work right, it could be very complex and daunting. Now, I said earlier in this domain that a lot of business continuity plans actually go out of date, and that's because they're looked at as a project. And that a team gets together, they do the impact analysis, they develop the plan, they say, thank God it's over, and they go on and do something else, and they just check off, yep, we've got a plan done. And so the business continuity plan shouldn't be thought of just as a project, because it has to be continually analyzed and updated. And as I said before, it's because the organization in no way is going to stay static. You're going to have new software, new hardware, new processes, merging with another company. So all of this directly affects your business continuity plan. If it's not out of date, if it is out of date, it can become obsolete and useless. So how do we ensure that we keep it up to date? Well, I always think it's good to have somebody to blame. So you make it somebody's responsibility that they have to ensure that the plan is getting updated at least annually. Sometimes it has to be more depending on the company and how critical the services are. But somebody should be responsible. You can't just say, yeah, we'll keep it up to date, and then because you're going to have a bunch of other things that happen. The plan should be integrated into your audits, like your internal audits. The auditors can come by and make sure that it actually, when has it last been updated? 4 or 5 years ago. Not good. And it should be implemented in your change control process within your organization. And there's actually tools that will automate this, meaning that when you have change control in your environment, somebody wants a change to happen, they have to actually submit it. They have to spell it out, what the change is, what the good, the bad, the ramifications of the change, and it goes through an approval process. Now, it's great if on the change control form that somebody has to fill out will be a question that says, does this affect the BCP? Does it affect the business continuity plan? And that will force people to actually think about it, because BCP is something that we don't usually think about. It's not something necessarily in our conscious day in and day out. So when you're thinking about making like a functionality change within the company, you have to consider the security issues, and you also have to consider if it affects a BC, because then it's going to have to be updated. So the overall plan itself, the business continuity plan, should identify the roles and responsibilities. We talked about that. There's a coordinator and there's different teams. It should have the different recovery procedures, and we went through the different things that need to have procedures for recovery, which are the business processes, facility recovery, supply and technology recovery, user environment, and data recovery. And we went through the different technologies for each of those. You have a damage assessment criteria that needs to be written out, so somebody doesn't just emotionally make a decision. They actually have to go through these steps to determine, yeah, this is a catastrophe or this is a disaster. The plan should have restoration and reconstitution procedures, how the how the plan is to be tested, and how this is to be integrated into awareness training, because all people need to be aware to a certain degree about what happens if something bad takes place, but the specific teams need to be, of course, trained to a further degree because they'll have responsibilities. And then how the plan is going to be maintained, which means how it's going to be updated, where it's going to be stored. This is a very good step process through business continuity, and you'll need to know the steps, but also which each piece is for. And like I said before, is that this is not actually developing a business continuity plan. There's experts that do it, that specialize in it, but most security people don't necessarily know how to do it properly. And a lot of people think that they know how to do it, and so they'll develop a plan, and they don't really hit all the pieces, or they don't think about the interdependencies, and they don't think about what the company has to communicate to outside. And once you miss, one or more of those pieces, it could be devastating to the company overall.